Hey guys, and welcome back. Let's review where we are so far. So we've created our Kubernetes cluster with our master nodes and our node pool, which is basically containing our worker nodes here. And then we've deployed two pods individually, just called NGINX and NGINX2. And then we've created a service controller in front of those two pods that is configured with a cluster IP, but no load balancer on it. And then we've also installed the NGINX Ingress controller, which we just did by running a kubectl apply on the URI to the proper manifest file that does the installation process for us. And now at this point, we have kind of our single service running here. We don't yet have a second service running down here, but what we don't have yet is this Ingress resource that we have right over here. And the Ingress resource, again, if you remember from the very first video where we talked about the architecture here, the Ingress resource is what determines the different routing rules based on either the hostname or the URL path of the request that's coming in from a user across the internet. So there's a couple of things to do here. One is to set up the Ingress resource to route traffic to either, I guess, service 1 for now. So we can kind of delete that link and we'll just route to service 1. And then we'll also need to set up DNS to actually point at the load balancer once that load balancer gets created. So if we head over to our AWS Management Console here, go down to EC2 load balancers right down here, you'll see that at the moment, let's see, it looks like it did actually create a load balancer for us right here. However, the service itself is not actually exposed on it. Only the service has a cluster IP. It's not actually configured to route traffic from this load balancer at this moment. So if I was to try to go out to this DNS name right now, right down here, that's automatically generated by AWS, let's just give that a try and see what we get. Sure enough, you can see that the load balancer is actually forwarding traffic to the NGINX Ingress controller. However, the NGINX Ingress controller does not have any routes configured on it, and so therefore the NGINX controller doesn't know what to do with this traffic. But at least we do know that the load balancer has been created and set up to forward traffic to the NGINX controller that's running on the Kubernetes cluster. And we could also take a look at the logs for that. So if we switch back over to the terminal here, we could take a look at the namespace called NGINX-ingress, or is it ingress-nginx? Let's do get all. Yeah, it's called ingress-nginx. And we could take a look at the logs on this pod and just kind of see what happened in there. We didn't do that before, but we could do that now. We'll go back into Ingress NGINX and say logs for that pod with that name. And sure enough, you can see down here that it is spun up okay. And right down here, you can actually see that we did get an inbound request from some host out there. And it looks like it got a 400 response. So that's pretty sensible, since that's kind of what we expected to see. So now what we need to do is go ahead and create the Ingress resource that actually creates the routing rules from an external hostname to our service that we've created. So let's head over to the documentation for the Ingress controller, and then we'll head over to the user guide here and take a look at basic usage. And this is going to show you kind of an example deployment here, where if you have a couple of services like my service A and my service B, and maybe you've got a couple of domain names like myservice.a.foo.org and myserviceb.foo.org, maybe you want to take those two DNS names and forward the traffic for those two DNS names to different services. At the moment, we only have a single service though. So what we're going to do is just grab this Ingress resource here, and we'll copy that into our deployment manifest, and then we'll use that to control the deployment of the Ingress resource. However, we're going to have to tweak a couple of these variables first. So let's come over here, and we'll just add in a new line here, and I'll just kind of keep this all together for now in the same file. And we're going to optionally give this a name. So I'm going to call this Ingress Trevor, just so I can uniquely identify that in my cluster. And then we're going to leave the Ingress class name the same. If you recall from an earlier video, the deployment of the NGINX Ingress controller actually created a unique type of class in the cluster called the NGINX resource. And so that's what we're going to use as the class name for this particular Ingress. And then down here under the rules, this is where we have an array, and you can tell it's an array because in YAML syntax, all arrays have individual elements that start with a dash. So this entire object right here is actually a single object in an array here, and it's got properties of host and HTTP, and then HTTP has a whole bunch of child properties. Now what you'll notice here is that we have a host name, and this can be the DNS name that we want to set as the external access URL to our internal Kubernetes service. So what you'll want to do is have a domain name set up, and so I'm going to be using Route 53 in AWS for this purpose, but of course you could use whatever DNS provider you would like to. And what we're going to be doing is taking a name on our DNS domain, and we're going to send that traffic over to the load balancer. So I'm going to create actually a record here that's called Trevor NGINX .cbttrevor.com, and we're going to CNAME that traffic over to the load balancer's DNS name. So I'll come back to the EC2 console here and find our network load balancer here, and that was created just a few minutes ago, and we're going to grab the external DNS name for that, and then we're going to configure that as the target for the Trevor NGINX alias here. So we'll hit create records, and that'll take a few minutes to propagate probably. But while that's propagating, let's go ahead and configure that DNS name in our configuration manifest here. So we'll bring that in as the host name that we want to route traffic from. And then down here under the HTTP section, we can choose the paths where we want to route traffic to. So if the path is root, basically nothing after the DNS name, then we are going to route to a backend, and the backend is going to be a service that has a port exposed on it. So what we're going to do is figure out the name of our service and then target that service from this Ingress resource. So we'll head back over here to our command line. We'll do kubectl get all from the Trevor namespace, and our service is named service/Trevor-NGINX service. And so that's going to be the target, of course, without the resource type. It'll just be Trevor-NGINX service. That's the name of the service that we want to route traffic to from this host name. And then the service is exposed on port 80. So if we do a kubectl describe all on that namespace and take a look at the service down here, you can see that our port on our service is port 80. And that service is going to target port 80 on the pods that are backing it. And you can see under the endpoints property right here, the two pod IP addresses, which have IP addresses coming from the VPC itself, not the cluster's CIDR block. And so the service will basically route traffic over to these IP addresses on the VPC itself, because those are the pod IP addresses. So what we're going to do now is just save this file. Actually, I'm just going to copy it and bring it over into our terminal, and we'll just edit deployment.yaml. I'll do 100dd just to delete all the lines here. Let me try that again, 100dd, and then we'll do I for insert, and then we'll just go ahead and paste this in, and right down here at the end we've got our Ingress resource. So let's save that file, and then we'll do a kubectl apply on the same file name, and of course in this Trevor namespace where our application lives. And as you can see, it's complaining about the version here, so apparently it wants us to use v1 instead of v1 beta 1. So I'm just going to open this up, and we'll go ahead and just change the version here for the resource to be v1 instead of v1 beta 1. And we'll just do a reapply. And it looks like it doesn't like the properties here, and that's probably because I grabbed the version for the older versions of Kubernetes out there. So I actually need the newer syntax here, and what you'll see is that the old syntax has the service name and service port. However, if your Kubernetes cluster is newer than version 1.19, then it's actually going to have a backend with a service object, and then it has a child property called name port, and then port has a child property of number. So we actually need to fix that up and make sure that host is set properly there as well. So let's open up our deployment file here, and we'll do service, and then we'll give it a name property, and we'll give it a port property as well. And the port, I believe, had a number property on it. So service, name, port, and then number. And I think that should fix our syntax here. So let's just go ahead and double check that that looks okay. We've got rules, we've got host, HTTP paths. Yeah, I think that looks good. So let's go ahead and copy this, and we'll bring it back over into our terminal here. And we'll just edit our deployment file again. And I'll delete everything out of there and repaste everything with the new syntax here. And then we'll save, and we'll just do a reapply on that. And it looks like it's still not happy here. So let's figure out which property is wrong this time. So it says it doesn't like service in the Ingress backend. And that's happening because I forgot to update the version here in my VS Code environment. I'm just getting out of sync here between my VS Code and my terminal. So let's edit one more time here. We'll do 100dd and insert and paste this in. So now we've got v1 here, and we've got the correct syntax for service name, port, and number. And then we'll go ahead and do a reapply on that once more. And now it says I need path type. So let's see about path type in our documentation here. Let's head back over to the user guide, take a look at the basic usage here. And it looks like the path type actually needs to be set to prefix here. So let's go ahead and plug that in for under our path here. Make sure our indentation is correct. And so it'll be right under the path. Yep, that looks good. And so let's try this one last time here. And I think we've got everything to the point where we can deploy this successfully. So let's do insert and paste, save, and we'll do a reapply. Sure enough, now we are able to create our Ingress resource right here. Let's just do a kubectl get all on our namespace Trevor. And you'll notice that kubectl doesn't show it by default here. And so that's because in kubectl, it only returns certain types of resources. However, if you run kubectl API resources, you can actually see all the different supported types of resources. And there is a resource type called ingresses. So if we actually query for ingresses, we could get that back from here. So instead of doing all, we'll say show me ingresses. And sure enough, there is our ingress resource. So now we can do a kubectl describe on that. And what you'll notice is that we have our address here, which is our load balancer. So that's our load balancer's DNS name. And that's going to be configured to forward traffic over to our service with the name Trevor NGINX service. And of course, that service points to two different pods named NGINX and NGINX2. So now what we can do is actually test out hitting our load balancer endpoint for starters. So let's try that. And I think we're just going to get a 404. And that's because our ingress resource has a host name configured that's forwarding to it. And this load balancer name doesn't actually match that. So what we need to do is actually access it on trevornginx.cbttrevor.com. And as you can see, that will properly route the traffic to our service and give us our NGINX landing page. So that's how we can configure the URI-based routing in our ingress resource and use the NGINX ingress controller under the covers. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.